Okay. Live stream should be started right now. So everything will be recorded and we snip the worst things afterwards. So we have some participants too. You're welcome. We'll wait another 1 or 2 minutes. Then I will start with some explanations. And then we will start the rest of our we have some 266 participants to join us. And now I'll give you here we are. So welcome. It's now 3:05. Welcome to all of the world. We have some people there from UK, from Germany, from America, but also from Asia. So it's tonight or early in the morning or PM right now in Europe. You're all invited to join us to this talk, Indicators and Targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And I will start right now. Oh, when it works, not really. I have to stop it because I will have a poll for you. So everybody is invited to give some explanation about the status. If you are a researcher, student, PhD, postdoc, or something like that. Only 2 questions, but maybe it's quite interesting for us to know
So maybe
who
while
you are
answering the poll, I can briefly present IUBS, so it will give time to people to answer.
Okay. So you're welcome.
Thank you.
To share.
So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar organized by IUBS, the International Union of Biological Sciences, on indicators targets for the Global Biodiversity Framework. So while you are answering the poll, I will briefly introduce you to IUBS and the activities of IUBS. So IUBS is the International Union of Biological Sciences. We are an NGO that was established in 1919. So we are rather old. We have only institutional memberships, and it's national academies or National Council of Science or international societies in the field of biology. We are developing scientific activities that are international and multidisciplinary. So we have few examples of the main areas of our work. So we have a triennial scientific program. We have one on big data, biodiversity and health and big data. We have also the Science Policy for Biodiversity Forum, which is part of the event today. We have also a program on pastoralism and socio-ecosystems, another one on zoonotic diseases. And we also work on taxonomy and nomenclature to harmonize the dialogue with everyone. We are also, with other union, a member of the International Year of Basic Science for Sustainable Development that now became the decade for the sustainable science. So we are one of the union part of this alliance. We have also a program on climate change and education. So it's a online tool for teachers who want to teach whatever discipline, biology or mathematics, for instance, using climate change examples. We have also another education program on education and ecology in the Anthropocene. We have also a committee on equal opportunities in biological sciences, and we are part of the gender equality committee that gather different unions. So we have a collaboration with different international unions, UNESCO, the International Science Council, for instance. And today you are part of this webinar series of the Science Policy for Biodiversity Forum. The forum was initiated in 2006, and we participated already in 5 science forums that were organized either during the COP in different countries or also online in 21. We will be also organizing with other partners the Science Policy for Biodiversity Forum during the COP16 in Cali. And before this Science Forum in Cali, we organized already several online events. So you can see here the former one that were organized on invasive species, digital sequence information, the role of indigenous people in conservation, and today it's the one on indicators and targets, and you can find all of them on IUBS website. So now I give the floor to Carsten, who will give us the result of the poll.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. And now the poll. It's surprising because 40% are others. So those who said others can give us some hintful advice what they mean with others. Just use the chat function right now to tell us about the others, because we have some 25% researchers, academia, and another 16% research managers, less educators, but lots of master students, bachelor students, PhD students, and postdoc fellows, and even some science professional from industry too. But the others would be quite interesting. And when we look on the map, then Asia is in favor. It's about more than 20% come from Asia, some 10% from Africa, and less from Australia and Eastern Europe. Hardly anybody from the Middle East, but of course North America and South America, although it's very early in the morning, and of course It's 3:00 p.m. Western Europe is in favor of all, with more than 30%. So here we are, and now I want to give another explanation. You see the Q&A button. There you can ask all the people, or especially the panelists, anything about today's topics. And in the chat, I prefer the technical questions and the special questions on I'm not a student or a researcher, but another one. That would be nice to improve our poll series. So I'll get back to Natalie right now, and you're welcome to start the webinar.
Thank you, Karsten. So before we begin, let me introduce the organizer of today's session, Lily Rodriguez. Lily is an herpetologist and an expert in biodiversity conservation. She is currently the secretary of the Center for the Conservation, Research and Management of Natural Area, CIMA, of which she is one of the founders. She is also involved in several programs of the Convention of Biodiversity, the CBD. She was a member of the IUBS Executive Committee from 2009 to 2019, and she has been instrumental in organizing the different science forums in the past. So Lily, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Natalie. Good morning to everyone, and thanks for being in this webinar, which is very exciting and challenging on the topics. Indicators and targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework are instrumental for the implementation of this new program to 2030. So I want to introduce you James Williams. James is a senior international biodiversity advisor and has recently been selected as one of the ad hoc technical expert group. He is the co-chair of this group for the indicators, and he's going to present us about the implementing the monitoring framework of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, challenges to measuring progress. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Lily. And I'll just share my screen. Hopefully this is going to work. Can I check that you can see my screen now? Hopefully you can now see my slides and they've gone full screen. If you could just confirm that for me, please.
It works.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. I can't see anything apart from my screen, my slides at the moment. So thank you very much indeed. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you may be. As Lily kindly said, I've had the honour of co-chairing the ad hoc technical expert group on indicators for the CBD with Maria Cecilia Londono Murcia from Colombia, and a group of excellent people who've been able to do an enormous amount of work over the last year. It's worth starting off with a little reminder about the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and the fact that it's part of a package of decisions agreed at COP15 in Montreal. That includes not just the framework of targets and goals, but the monitoring framework, which I'll go into in much more detail in a moment, information about benefit sharing on digital sequence information, resource mobilization, a mechanism for planning, monitoring, reporting and review, and capacity building and technical scientific cooperation. And it's important to stress that all of that was decided at the same time and is all part of a package that is important to grasp as a whole. So let's have a quick look at an overview of the KMGBF itself. Its purpose is to catalyse particularly transformative action to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. There's a 2050 vision about valuing biodiversity that is conserved, restored and wisely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet and delivering benefits essential for all people. And that's important because the conventional biological diversity has 3 objectives. It's about conservation, but it's also sustainable use, and it's about benefits to people. And then there's a 2030 vision about taking urgent action to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, to put nature on a path to recovery. And I'm not going to read all the words. It's there if you want to read them for yourselves. But the important point here is that this is cross-cutting. It's not just about species. It's not just about ecosystems. It's not just about genes. It's about people as well. And it's really important that all of those aspects are seen together. There are 4 goals that are to be achieved by 2050, so that vision overall. And again, I'm not going to go through the wording of each of these. They are quite complicated. But I think it's important to stress that this is about biodiversity, it's about sustainable use, it's about benefit sharing, and it's about those resources that are needed in order to be able to achieve goals A, B, and C. There are then 23 targets that are to be achieved by 2030, and those can be grouped into 3 groups. I don't have time to go through each of the targets in detail. To do that would be a whole webinar on its own, but I do want to stress that there's information here, targets here about reducing threats to biodiversity, about meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing, and about tools and solutions. And just as an example, here is target 3 that you may have heard about as being the 30 by 30 target. There's actually 2. Target 2 is about restoration and 30% restoration as well. But target 3 has 11 different elements in here. It's incredibly complicated. And one of the things that's really important is that all of those elements need to be achieved in order to be able to achieve the target as a whole. So in parallel with the agreement of the framework in Decision 15.4, as I said before, it's a package, and there was a monitoring framework established in Decision 15/5. And that decision also established the ad hoc technical expert group, which is comprised of 45 experts selected from something over 260 experts who expressed interest in taking part. And Maria and myself have had the honour of co-chairing the work. I don't have time to go through all of the detail of all of the work that we've been doing. It's enormous, but I do want to stress some details in the next few minutes in my presentation. So the first thing to think about is, what is the framework itself? What's the monitoring framework? I've gone through the targets and the goals, but how do we monitor them? So the first thing is that there's a set of headline and binary indicators which are there for all parties to use in order that they can show quantitative progress towards the progress of the individual targets. So the headline indicators are quantitative at a national level and will be quantitative at a global level. The binary indicators come from the idea that for some of these issues, it's not going to be possible to have a headline indicator. They don't necessarily exist at the moment for all of the targets. And therefore, some of this should be more based on the process work that's being done to show progress is being made against those targets. And the initial idea was that those would be questions which would have a yes or no answer, hence the title binary. But in terms of the AHTEG's work, we determined that actually it would be better to have a more simple questions and more nuanced answers. And that is the advice that has been passed across to SBSTA and CBD COP. There's also 2 sets of component and complementary indicators which are optional for parties to use. And the intention here is that those supplement the headline and binary indicators because of the complexity of the individual goals and targets. And at a national level, therefore, it's expected that parties will be obligated through their national reports in 2026 and 2029 to provide information against those headline and binary indicators, and they may choose to provide information against some of the component and complementary indicators. I think it's extremely unlikely that any party will provide information against all 250 of the indicators in the framework as a whole. And in addition, parties may wish to use national indicators, which may provide more nuanced information under their national circumstances, or where they have particularly good data that they wish to take advantage of. And therefore, in terms of the implementation of the monitoring framework, there's going to need to be quite a lot of balancing between idealism and pragmatism. In October, the AHTEG started its work in April, May 2023. We've had 4 online meetings and 2 face-to-face meetings. At the end of our second face-to-face meeting in October 2023 in Montreal, we developed a table showing where the indicators were in terms of their state of development. And we classified them into 5 different groups: whether methods have been developed, is there a process underway, is the data not yet widely available but work has been done, further investment needed, and the indicator is operational. And those indicators marked with a red star are those which, when the monitoring framework was adopted, didn't have a methodology. And therefore, those were the ones that the AHTEG was particularly asked to make sure that we did work on to bring them forwards to make them operational. As at the end of our second face-to-face meeting in March this year, I'm delighted to be able to say that all of those which are now in blue text have moved forward at least 1 grade or 1 status code, and some of them have moved forward more than 1. All of the indicators have had work done on them, but some of them haven't had quite enough to be able to move forward into the next status category. I should note that for indicators 1.1 and 9.1, we have not yet been able to provide a methodology. 1.1 relates to spatial planning, both marine and terrestrial spatial planning. And it's a really very complicated situation in terms of trying to understand the amount of spatial planning and the amount of spatial planning which is, for example, taking account of biodiversity, which is taking account of human needs, and therefore actually which number should be being proposed to be used as the headline indicator. More work is needed on that. 9.1 is in some ways a disaggregation of B1. It's about the sustainable use and ecosystem services achieved from wild species. And again, it's one where some further work is needed to be able to come up with a clearer view on what it is that should be being used as a headline indicator, because again, this is an incredibly complicated and complex subject. So we've been undertaking, give me a second, a series of webinars to cover a range of the subjects that the AHTEG's worked on, and the link for those is there. They're on the CBD website. I would encourage you all to go and look at those webinars, and the first one of them on the 9th of April gives a much wider overview of the work that we've been doing that I don't have time to go into now. What I will say is that there's also going to be a workshop on the 11th of May in Nairobi as part of the lead-in to Substa 26. That will be streamed online as well as being face-to-face. So please do join in with that workshop if you would like to know more. I want to move on now to just to remind people of some of the big picture of what we're trying to achieve here, because we've got the framework and parties are currently putting forward national commitments as part of a national targets template, which will then get brought together to allow COP16 to undertake a review of the ambition that there is at a party at a national level in order to understand whether or not there's sufficient ambition to meet the ambition within the framework as a whole. The AHTEG is also reporting in to COP16. In 2026 and in 2029, there will be the 7th and 8th national reports by parties, using these indicators, and that will show the progress that's been made towards those national commitments, and therefore the amount of implementation that's taken place with respect to the amount of ambition that there's been. And that will again lead into a midterm and an end term stock take on progress that's been made, and that of course will lead into post 2030 updates to whatever the framework may be at that point. It's worth noting that there's also some other inputs that will be being made in due time here. So the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IUBS, will be undertaking their monitoring assessment, which is due to report in to COP17. And similarly, the second global assessment on progress is due to be being made in 2028, which will then feed into that global stocktake on progress and will hopefully help to work out what will be going on in terms of what targets may be needed for post 2030. And bear in mind, of course, that the SDGs will also run out at 2030, so those will need to be renewed as well. So quite a lot to look forward to in 2030 as this whole implementation of the monitoring framework and of the Global Biodiversity Framework plays out over the next very few years. So it's always good in an opening presentation, particularly when we're on a science forum, to put some challenges out there. And I think that these are things that I would suggest are things that the forum might wish to consider in its work going forwards. And the first one is to learn the detail. It is complicated, and it's complicated to think about how all of this lot fits together. There are some sensitivities, both political and technical, about some of the way in which some of these targets are worded. And that's important in terms of thinking about different constituencies in different parts of the world. Science always wants to be cutting edge, but actually implementation may not need cutting edge science, but its application may need to be cutting edge. And I would urge you to think about how the cutting edge science that you're involved in can be applied. And remember that monitoring, while it may not be academically sexy, is essential. We do need to know where we are in terms of progress being made and in terms of understanding how changes in the world interact with each other. So therefore, new indicators must be tested, they must be made available for parties, and they must be useful for parties if they're actually going to get picked up and used at a national level. And I think it's also important to remember the linkages between traditional knowledge and science in order to think about those integrated assessments of progress against the global goals and targets. I hope that's of some interest and help, and I look forward to further discussions as we move forward. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, James. Sunita.
No, I was just going to ask if there were any questions for James. We could take one or two at this time before we move to the next presentation.
Q&A
Not just from the
row.
panelists, it could be in the Q&A.
No, we have no questions right now in the Q&A.
I apologize to those who I don't actually normally present on Zoom. I'm afraid I didn't know how to get rid of that stop sharing tab. I apologize if that was obscuring some of the text on the slides.
Someone wants the link of the webinars. Okay.
Yeah, I will show it to you.
It looks like no questions at the moment, but we can always come back during the discussion. Lily, back to you for the next presenter, to introduce the next presenter.
Thank you. Yes, our next presenter is Alice Hughes. She is a conservation biologist based in Asia, associate professor at the School of Biological Sciences in Hong Kong. She's from Bristol University, and working on biodiversity patterns and developing effective conservation and management approaches. Alice is going to present on the monitoring framework from the scientific perspective, overview, and gaps. Alice, please.
Thank you, Lily. It's great to be here virtually with you all today, and it's great to follow from James so that I can fill in some other perspectives on the monitoring framework overall, as well as commenting on some of the work of the AHTEG, and it really does have its work cut out for it. So first off, James has already said this, but the GBF is made of 4 major goals and 23 targets, some of which are split down into sub-targets. Now, that isn't my focus today, but it's important to know that, as James said, most of these goals will have a headline indicator attached to it, not all of them, and some of them will also have a binary indicator attached to it. This is a major advance from former global biodiversity targets, where whilst the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership did develop some indicators to try to measure progress towards the Aichi targets, this is really a formalization of that process. And having the monitoring framework really allows us to hopefully track our way towards actually reaching these global biodiversity targets in the future. Within the Global Biodiversity Framework itself, as a scientist, most of us acknowledge that some of the targets are unfortunately vague. This is in part the product of having negotiations in the midst of COVID, where many of the discussions took place online. There were other national priorities, and I think everyone lost touch with their humanity, which meant that often there was less willingness to compromise. And when we went into the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework discussions in Montreal, there were over 900 brackets that had to be discussed. And so actually getting a framework at all is an incredible feat, given the mountain of barriers that we faced. Unfortunately, there's also somewhat a failure to recognize some of the continued problems with overutilization of biodiversity systems. Some of the targets are difficult to see how they would function. For example, there is one target on increasing ocean resilience to acidification, but geoengineering cannot be part of how we actually reach these targets. And whilst there are some ways to reach this target without it, it is likely to be incredibly challenging to reach a target like that. Many of these targets also require the identification of key areas for conservation, but there isn't any background discussion or information on how we can actually decide what is a high biodiversity area, for example. Within the final discussions, precaution and horizon scanning were also removed. There were texts that included these initially. It was not included in the final version of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and that means that whilst we may get rid of some problems, there are no means to prevent those kinds of problems coming up again as we fix them. Within the monitoring framework, which is, as I said, meant to help us track as we go towards, hopefully, targets, there are a number of major elements. Now, James has already detailed what that structure looks like, so we will be brief here, but there are the headline indicators. Each of the targets was meant to have at least one headline indicator, as we'll see in a moment. That was not always the case. And in addition, there are the optional complementary and constituent indicators and binary indicators. Now, each target may have a binary indicator and a headline indicator, or it may have neither. This is because the discussions were complex, they were not always agreed upon, and much of this was decided whilst we were all in Montreal, whilst they are being finessed, and they will be completed, hopefully, at the COP16 that will take place in Cali later this year in Colombia. These indicators may be key to the success of the biodiversity framework. In theory, they were all meant to use well-recognized, accepted data sets with methodologies. As James has already said, that wasn't actually how it turned out. So some of these have no methodology, some of the targets have no indicator whatsoever, and there are clear mismatches between some of the targets and some of the indicators. And I'll go into what some of that looks like in just a moment's time. So this is what some of it looks like. As I stated earlier, there are 4 broad targets. I will largely be focusing on, 4 broad goals. I'll largely be focusing on A and B. So if we look at A and B here, we can see that goal A has 4 major headline indicators and goal B has 1. Now, where it has this asterisk here, and I'll note it in a minute, it shows that we don't actually yet have a methodology for that. And that has been one of the first tasks of the AHTEG, where we have a headline indicator with no methodology, is actually developing how we can measure this reliably. When we break that down for those first two goals, you can see we have a whole list of headline indicators, and all of these were meant to be within this SMART framework, meaning they are specific, so we know what we're doing, they're measurable, so we can see how much we've achieved, they're achievable, so they're not just a dream that we can't achieve, they are relevant, and so there should be a close association between that indicator and what the target is trying to achieve, and they are time-bound, meaning that we can achieve them in a time, and that time is given as part of the indicator. So let's look at some of these. The red list index, so that's the red list of species, is our main indicator for species. There is the additional one, as you can see there, A5, which is the population 500 indicator, but there are multiple problems with the red list of species. For one thing, it is not time-bound. An assessment is considered out of date when it is at least 10 years old. This means that if we are hoping to achieve these targets and be able to measure them by 2030, many of these species will not have a single data point in terms of how they're doing. If the population has gone up and down, what the status of that species is. And as many assessments are already out of date, they're more than 10 years old, this means that it is not a time-bound indicator. And I'll go into some of the other problems with the red list later in this discussion. In terms of if they are specific and relevant, if we look at target 5, which is about the sustainable utilization of species, the only current measure is the proportion of fish stocks, which are currently being harvested sustainably. Now, I'll go into more of the details here in a moment, but this is a clear mismatch when the IUBS states that there are more than 50,000 wild species in trade, and most of those are not fishes. So for the majority of species in trade, we do not have any actual indicator which is showing us reliably how they are doing. All of those asterisks indicate no methodology. So this is the first goal of the AHTEG, is to make these indicators operational. At the moment, they're not. And so at present, that first slew of headline indicators was largely not operational because many of them had no methodology. And if we look at target 9, which is associated with target 5, both of those are on the sustainable use of biodiversity, we can see that both of the indicators there are not actually biodiversity indicators. They are about the benefits to people. And whilst this is important, and you can see what that actual goal is at the bottom, the sustainable management of wild species, we do not know what species are in trade, we do not know the volumes they're at, and we do not know their origins. And so unless we look at how we actually record data representatively, there is literally no way we can achieve either of those targets. And as IUBS recognizes that unsustainable trade is the major threat to many species, these targets are currently not operational. The indicators are not fit for purpose for either of those targets. And if we look more broadly, so this is looking at most of the targets, if we look to see which have no indicators, as I stated previously, many of them currently do not have an indicator, which means we have no way of measuring if we are making progress. During the first mandate of the AHTEG, they were not told to look at indicators for any of the targets that did not have an indicator. Now, some of these do have a complementary or constituent indicator, but those are not mandatory. And that means that some countries will do them, some will not, and we will not have reliable and consistent data for those. With many of the other indicators, there is a high degree of mismatch between what that indicator is measuring and what the target is trying to achieve. And so even if we make progress with that indicator, it may not necessarily take us towards what that target is trying to achieve. Now, for me, having an indicator is essential, but renewing the terms of the AHTEG will also be essential because we know that given the short amount of time to actually decide on the initial indicators, many of them are not what we would like to see if they are genuinely going to be relevant to the targets at hand. And so if we have these major mismatches with indicators, what do we actually need? Many of the targets rely on temporal data for monitoring. Others require us to identify key areas for conservation, but there is no mechanism for how we can identify what those areas are. Again, there are many possible options, but there is no guidance as to how we might be able to do this. Many of the indicators are also too simple, and many of the better indicators were relegated to being complementary or component indicators because parties simply didn't understand them. Now, it is true that we did not have a great amount of time, but some of the best indicators, like the population 500 indicator, were actually agreed upon because of the work of task forces with parties to gain support for more empirically supported indicators. And so as scientists, it is or should be part of our mandate, role, and responsibility to not only be gathering the data we need to have better indicators, but to work with parties so that they understand them and trust them. And this is a process that can take many years. And so, given that we are moving towards future COPs, we need to be looking now at what those mismatches are, where we have data gaps, and working with parties to get scientifically backed indicators that they can actually either elevate from the complementary or component indicators or have as fresh indicators for future frameworks. But that is not going to happen without the engagement of scientists working with parties to gain support for these more empirically supported indicators. There is also a major problem that there is no glossary, and that means that we have potential loopholes and the potential for greenwashing. And I'll mention some of the key problematic terms in a few moments. The IUBS has also had to go through this, and every single time it makes a report, of course, it needs to make sure that people have a universal understanding of key terms within that report. So with every report, they will also publish a glossary of agreed on terms and what they mean within the report. This prevents misunderstanding and prevents the abuse of those terms. And yet the CBD has no real similar mechanism, meaning that we have huge loopholes where a term might be used but could be differently interpreted by different parties, and many of the terms that relate to forestry will default to an FAO definition, which is not centered on biodiversity or ecology, but centers on a forestry and economic perspective. As I noted, there are major mismatches between some of the indicators. And so let's think about some of the data that is key to upholding and actually empirically supporting some of these targets. So I mentioned before target 5 and target 9. At the moment, the only indicator for target 5 is sustainable fish stocks. But as I noted, IUBS notes that over 50,000 wild species are in trade. CITES lists about 39,000. Most of these are orchid. Some of them cannot be traded. LEMIS alone, so LEMIS is the US Fish and Wildlife Service's import and export database of wildlife. The US alone since 2020 has imported almost 30,000 species. More than half of these come from the wild. And if we look at what these are, you can see that the majority of these species are not fish. Less than 3,000 of these 30,000 species are fish. And this means for the majority of species in trade, we have absolutely no data of the quantity or their origin and whether they come from the wild. And that means that targets 5 and 9 are not operational and have no indicator. Now we have a choice here. Countries like the US use the LEMIS system. In Europe, we have the TRACES system, though the data is not publicly available. That means that we could gather much better data on what species are in trade, providing essential baseline information to actually assess what is sustainable. But at the moment, there is very little dialogue in actually making better data available, despite the fact that we have the opportunity to do so. And we need to be having this discussion more widely, because otherwise we will continue to fail to actually ensure species are not threatened and potentially going extinct because of trade. Furthermore, this is often inconsistently measured. So here, fish trade, the one indicator. And yet this is largely on fish that are being consumed rather than those being used ornamentally. And we know, for example, most of those wonderful saltwater aquariums are using fish that are caught from the wild and have vanishingly little data in many cases on what is being imported, because unfortunately, most countries do not see fish or insects as a priority and often will not list a quantity and may just say drop fish. So we may not have the species level data we need to understand what is in trade. Goal A has the IUCN Red List as the major measure of what species are threatened. As I noted, that an assessment is only considered out of date when it is more than 10 years old. So for the majority of species, we will not have a single data point before 2030, meaning that we cannot use this as a measure of how species are doing. When we've looked at this, it is also not consistent. So here A is amphibians, B is birds, M is mammals, O is odonata, the dragonflies, and R is reptiles. When we look at how species are digitized within the IUCN Red List, we see glaring inconsistencies between species. So A shows the county boundaries of the US. It's used to delineate amphibian range boundaries, but only in the US. Elsewhere, different standards and metrics are used. B shows the dragonfly range boundaries, where for the whole of the old world, they used river basins. But in the new world, they didn't use that approach. And I've had researchers approach me saying that they saw biogeographic differences in species distributions between the two regions, when actually this is just an artifact of different methods. C shows 111-kilometer or 60-kilometer grids, because for the reptiles, they used a different approach again, when they used a gridded approach to digitize where species are. And in addition to that, political boundaries are commonly used to delineate species ranges, meaning that stacked IUCN maps, whilst commonly used for prioritizing areas for conservation, have major spatial biases, and furthermore can miss more than 50% of species distributional points. If we map this out consistently, we find that even the cleaning methods suggested by the IUCN do not overcome the glaring problems with these maps. And if we create heat maps, we may get huge differences even across small areas. The map you see now is a biodiversity map for bats in Southeast Asia, where you can see a 60 species difference over the Chinese border because of the use of political boundaries by the IUCN. When this is our only real species indicator that is being used as an indicator within the framework, we have a huge problem when we know that it does not map species accurately, it does not track their changes over time, and from some analysis we just completed, we found that some of the rarest species have almost no data in terms of the bibliography used to support species assessments and do not cite any data in digitizing species ranges or distributions. And so we have a huge problem when a major component of biodiversity is species. We do not have a good species indicator currently within the monitoring framework. So the Red List and the Population 500 indicators are the only species level indicator within the indicator framework. But whilst the Population 500 indicator is rigorous and it only got there because of the GBIKE task force, it currently only covers a tiny proportion of species in a tiny proportion of countries. And it will take a lot of time to get the level of data we need to ensure that it monitors biodiversity consistently across countries. And the Red List does not allow the level of monitoring we need within a monitoring framework. And so other methods will be needed to get that species level indicator to ensure we can actually see what those trends look like. And the only other data are things like the WWF assessment, and anyone who has looked at that data in detail will see just how inconsistent it is across space, time, and taxa. And so for most species, we do not have any good data to help understand how they are doing within the monitoring framework. Target 21 is a data target, so it looks at data mobilization. But I thought it would be useful for those watching to understand what the data looks like now. And so the best way to visualize data is, of course, to look at a map. And whilst we now have literally billions of records within GBIF, as well as other complementary data sets like that of iNaturalist and eBird, that data may not be as representative as we would all hope it would be. So here, black on the land represents roads, black in the ocean represents seaways, so where we have shipping routes, green areas represent cities, and yellow represents data. And what you can see is not only does the majority of biodiversity data come from high GDP areas, so highly developed, high-income economies, but also more than 90% of the data comes from 2 kilometers of a road, normally at a low elevation in a temperate woodland. And if it comes from the ocean, it comes from within 2 kilometers of the coast normally. And so unfortunately, whilst the amount of data we have has increased astronomically, it is still not representative. And the only way to fill those data gaps is not only if scientists get better at sharing their data, which often they don't do, but also countries find other ways to mobilize the biodiversity data that gives us a much more realistic insight into where species are and allows us to map out biodiversity patterns. Furthermore, currently that data only covers a tiny percentage of the world's land surface, under 4% of the world if we use a 5-kilometer resolution, and if we use a higher resolution, that disappears to under 1% of the world's land surface. And as I noted, other data sets also have other inherent biases. So if we're looking at this data to try to help us conserve the right areas for biodiversity, unfortunately, at the moment, it's not quite there. So the map you'll see here, which looks like a road map of Australia, actually shows us the density of biodiversity data across Australia, which shows us just how many blank spots we have in the map where we do not have good data on biodiversity. And unfortunately, the red list does not fill in for this. And so we need to think about how at national levels and subnational levels, we can mobilize better data that provides a more realistic indicator of where species are. And we also need to remember that if we are reliant on the IUCN Red List, it still misses out the majority of non-vertebrate species, many of which we haven't even scientifically described yet. As I noted before, another major issue with both the global monitoring framework and the targets themselves is the lack of any glossary, meaning that many of the terms used within them could be misinterpreted or even misused deliberately to try to reach targets without actually doing the legwork. As I also noted earlier, IPBES will always develop a glossary when it makes a new report, but there is no equivalent within the CBD. And the binary indicators, which James also mentioned earlier, we need to agree on definitions because many of them are currently not qualitative, and so whether or not we reach them could be fairly arbitrary. So if we're looking at some of those key terms, this includes things like what is sustainable, because all of us probably have our own definition, terms like nature-based solutions, which can be used to plant monocultures, terms like agroecology, sustainable intensification. There are a raft of terms which should require an agreed upon definition, currently do not have them, leaving the framework subject to possible abuse. If we look at the binary indicators, and I will go fast now, I'm aware I'm probably already over time, it is absolutely crucial to agree on indicators that are meaningful. If you read through some of these, they may be as arbitrary as, do you have any framework in place that looks at sustainable development? If we do not have qualitative elements, many of these may come down to being a tick box exercise that doesn't actually allow us to move towards any positive biodiversity goal. And I know that this will fall within the remit of both SBSTA and the AHTEG, but it is very important to note that those qualitative elements will be essential for these binary indicators to be useful indicators of if we are actually moving towards targets in a useful way. In terms of other metrics, most of them may not be as representative as we might like. So the Red List of Ecosystems is a very useful framework and idea, but it's important to note that many of these assessments, we have no idea of when they will be repeated. They only exist for a subset of ecosystems, most of which are not publicly available, and the standards are not consistently applied, meaning that both for species and for ecosystems, we do not have the level of data we would like for these indicators to actually provide us with the information we need to move towards targets. And we also know that for specific ecosystems, like for caves, many of the existing frameworks, both that of species and of ecosystems, do not provide the resolution of data we need to target ecosystems which have the greatest degree of threat or the greatest degree of biodiversity, meaning that scientists need to come together to mobilize the data and to ensure that these indicators have the scientific integrity needed to indicate the health of these systems. And these mismatches currently are not being addressed within the scope of the AHTEG, but hopefully the CBD will give them the remit, because revisiting that remit and ensuring that they are truly relevant will be crucial if they are to provide the degree of protection that species will need moving forwards. So where do we go next? Unfortunately, bad analysis is easy. Scientists and those who can mobilize the data need to work to ensure that we have the data we need and that they advocate for targets, both within COP16 and for future biodiversity targets. Task forces like GBIKE have shown what concentrated workforces can do to ensure that we can advocate for better targets. And yet many scientists are still disengaged with these processes and are not good at sharing their data, despite the fact that we need that data if we are going to move better forwards towards these targets. We also do need to engage more with parties to ensure that we do have support and they do not actually dismiss better indicators as being too complicated, which we can't blame them for doing. And so if we want parties to support better indicators, we need to work with those parties to make sure that they understand them and support them, as well as having the resources they need to mobilize that kind of data. Understanding the limits of data is crucial if we are going to monitor these systems effectively and implement these new monitoring frameworks. But we also need agreed upon standards and protocols for both monitoring and within national plans. Better mobilization of data will be critical for tracking change, and this is also important given the context of the IUCN Red List not providing us with the data we need to do this. The AHTEG has done a fantastic job of evaluating indicators so far, but there is also a huge amount of work to do, particularly with addressing mismatches, as well as developing indicators for those targets that currently do not have a headline indicator. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening. Of course, I'm happy to take any questions you might have now, as well as in the discussion later. And I'm looking forward to what the rest of the panelists have to say, which I'm sure will add to what I've mentioned already. Thank you all.
Thank you, Alice. Perhaps we could take one question for clarification now, because we have another 3 presentations to go through and the discussion. There are some questions both in the Q&A and in the chat box, Alice. So there's somebody who wants to know if they could get the source of the table that you used, but you could perhaps just you could just mention that in the chat where they can find that information. Yeah.
The ones on the binary indicators, etc., are all on the CBD website. I'm happy to share my slides later, which will have links to tables. Some of them are from work that we've done, and I'll answer the rest of the questions in the chat because I know that we have another couple of speakers to fill in and add more details as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Alice. Now I would like to introduce Benjamin Stach.
Yeah, that's always a challenge internationally. You can say Stach maybe.
Ben is a senior scientist on environmental system science from the Global and Regional Dynamics Research Group at the Center for Environmental System Research at Kassel University in Germany. And he is going to present today on a nice method on methods for analyzing trade-offs between food security and conserving biodiversity and how it can shed light on monitoring Target 1. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Lily. Welcome everybody to this presentation. Yeah, I'm a land use scientist, and I'm interested with scientific methods to apply scenarios in order to harmonize future demands on land, because these different demands may cause some conflicts for achieving international targets. The presentation here is based on a publication that I wrote with my colleague Joseph Alcamo about system methods for analyzing the trade-off between food security and biodiversity conservation. Yeah. So systems methods are actually well usable to structure, model, simulate, and analyze dynamic interactions and behaviors of often complex dynamic systems. So they can be used in evaluation strategies, research projects, and program designs. In this presentation here, I would like to introduce 3 different approaches to you, which is systems diagrams, influence matrix. They will be described very briefly, and I will take a bit longer, bit more time to introduce you to integrated land use modeling. From the early beginning, I would like to be very clear that I'm presenting a methodological contribution to demonstrate the applicability of these 3 methods in a Ugandan case study. So there are some limitations in the studies. One is that we didn't engage a lot with regional stakeholders, but this kind of co-design is essential actually to address regional needs and characteristics in the social ecological systems. So it's a precondition to use results for project and program design. So please be aware of this. So Uganda, as most of you know better than me, is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, but it's also subject to food insecurity. And due to steadily very high annual population growth rates of around 3% per year, agriculture is the most single threat to biodiversity. So there is a high trade-off between food security and biodiversity conservation already, and it's estimated that this trade-off will likely increase in the future due to population growth and scarce land resources to fill the demands of people. The metric we are using, we applied is for food security, the number of people fed with an adequate diet from domestic agricultural production. So we focus here on the food availability dimension of food security, and not taking into account food imports, for example, because this fraction of food that is available to the population is not directly interfering with the national biodiversity. So it's not part of the trade-off. And for biodiversity conservation, we use cumulative habitat of threatened species. This gives a higher weight in the analysis to areas that accommodate several threatened species. For example, if a certain hectare of land accommodates 3 threatened species, this hectare of land is counted as 3 hectares. Yep. So we understand the 3 systems approaches that we are introducing as being complementary with advantages and disadvantages. So an example of a systems diagram is illustrated here. It's a very good exercise actually to engage with regional stakeholders to better understand the key variables of a system and the dynamic linkages that exist. So these diagrams can be used to bounce off trade-off system and to identify the main variables indicated here in boxes as state variables. So once these variables has been identified, they can be applied for drawing an impact matrix. And this is simply plotting all variables to each other. And from this exercise, you can draw the relative importance of variables to each other. Again, a good exercise for stakeholder engagement. For example, you have the agricultural area, key variable number 5. It shows a direct strong link to variable number 3, which is domestic agricultural production, and a moderate link to variable number 4, which is agricultural yield. So at the end, once you have identified the direct links between variables, you can create the active sum, which is at the end here. It actually sums up all weights that was introduced across the columns. And an active high value here indicates that this variable is strongly influencing other variables in the systems you're looking at. Whereas the passive sum, it sums up all variables across the rows, and it indicates that a variable with a high passive sum is strongly influenced by changes in the system. So it responds quite quickly to any change in the system you're looking at. So this gives already a good impression about the dynamics in the systems, but it's not giving us information related to the trade-off between food security and biodiversity. So what we are proposing from here is a so-called, what we call a critical change approach. And this is actually tracing backward the direct links of variables. So we have a critical change for variable 1, which is our food security indicator, and for variable number 2, which is the biodiversity indicator. And we're looking, well, which variable was influencing food security. And you look to go to the impact matrix and you see, okay, well, variable, the food security variable is influenced by domestic agricultural production. So you add a 3 here. Then you go to variable number 3, agricultural production. It is influenced by agricultural yield as well as agricultural area. Agricultural yield as well as agricultural area. And you proceed from variable to variable, and you do this for both indicators. So if you look to the critical changes now, there are some variables, some numbers more frequently listed than other variables. And this gives already an impression that these variables might be very critical for the trade-off in the land system you're looking at. In this case here, it shows that the land governance as well as agricultural yield are most often listed in the critical change. So they are of relevance, and we will pick them up later in the land use modeling for some policy evaluation studies. So if we come to the land use modeling assessment, so that's a bit of more complex interaction. So it's basically done by scientists who are familiar with coding, program coding, and developing it. But again, here, this exercise can also be done with interaction of stakeholders regarding data input and interpretation of modeling results. I would like to introduce you to the model we are used for doing these assessments, which is the land shift model, which is developed at our institute at Kassel University for almost 20 years now. So the model actually includes different sectors which compete for land resources. The data to do the simulation on land use dynamics, it integrates different types of data. The macro level data, these are usually statistics that are collected at the national level, the federal state level, or the municipality level, and it provides some key information, for example, on agricultural production. On the other hand, the model considered micro level data, which usually come from remote sensing activities or field service. They can integrate biodiversity data, for example. And this micro level data are then available in this case at a raster resolution of 1 square kilometer. That's the operating unit of the land shift model. And it could contain information on terrain slope, distance to roads and markets, and other relevant land use information. To initialize the base map, actually, the model is now allocating the different demand for land for different sectors to those grid cells that are ranked most suitable based on a multi-criteria analysis. And this multi-criteria analysis uses this spatial data at the grid cell level as input. I will not go into detail of this criteria analysis, but we may pick it up in the discussion later if you're interested in it. So once the base map is initialized, you can apply or you can use this model framework for scenario simulations if you have certain scenarios on the potential future socioeconomic development available. They describe how the population may change in the future, what the political situation is, and what the future food demands or the demands for other goods, land use related goods are. And when you combine this, you are able then to simulate land use change maps that provide relevant spatial explicit information over time, for example, in 5-year time steps from the baseline to the scenario period, which is 2050 in this case. I would now briefly introduce you to the scenario data that we are using. They come from the Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security Program in cooperation with the International Food Policy Institute. And key variables of the scenarios are that the population is increasing by 167%, and that there is an increase in agricultural production due to the demand of people by 181%. So come to the simulation experiment now. We investigate two potential policy options that has been identified by the critical change approach earlier, which was land governance processes and agricultural yield. So we have 4 scenarios. Okay, this is very simple, and please don't blame me for this, but for interpreting land governance processes, we consider effective conservation of protected area, as proposed by the World Data Bank on Protected Areas. So it's about ring fencing protected areas. And of course, I'm well aware that some relevant social interactions, social environmental interactions are ignored by having this simple estimate on yes and no, whether they are actively conserved. So the interaction from the protected area with the surrounding, it's ignored. And the question who is fenced in and who's fenced out is also ignored. And the second dimension of the scenario is then the improvement to the investment to improve agricultural yields, whether we have a stable yield condition with recent agricultural management in scenario A and C, or whether there is an investment to improve yields according to the scenarios from the IFPRI Institute. So we investigate 4 scenarios. And I would like to warn you at this moment, because from the base map, if you go to scenario 1 to 2050, what do we see? We see that a current agricultural management which has very low yields will not meet the food demands of the increasing population in the future, even when all land is converted into agricultural areas, which will likely not be the case. But the assessment also shows that if you conserve land and if you assume an effective management of protected areas, they will be conserved, but it will constrain food production and will further constrain agricultural production and increase food insecurity. Whereas scenario B and D, where agricultural investment and agricultural yields are considered as a policy option, they produce enough food as well as conserve areas, natural areas that could provide valuable habitats to species. So this illustration is now summed up in some key statistics, where we have the agricultural land extent, natural land extent, the agricultural production, how many kilocalories are produced, and how many million people can be fed from the domestic agricultural production, and what the cumulative habitat of threatened species are in these scenarios. To move myself aside, okay. So what we see, that increasing agricultural yields can feed almost 85 million people, and at the same time conserve habitat to threatened species. So it's a potential approach that can reduce the trade-off between biodiversity and food security. But these numbers are still very hard to identify the trade-off on its own, the trade-off. So what we propose is the calculation of a trade-off coefficient, which is actually the normalized deviation of cumulative habitat of threatened species at time t from its value in the base year. So the relative change of the habitat indicator divided by the normalized deviation of number of people fled from domestic agricultural production. And then, so we get here the final table, and this is the last table that I'm showing and sharing with you. Gives us the trade-off coefficient, and the larger the negative value of the trade-off coefficient is, the larger the trade-off at the end. So what we see is that ring fencing protected areas might be a good approach, scenario C, might be a good approach for conserving biodiversity, but due to the land constraint and the limitation of agricultural land for protected areas, it will end up in a very high trade-off in the future. Whereas investments to improve yields without any ring fencing seems to be much more efficient in reducing this trade-off. And the best case, it's not very surprising, but it's the combination of both policies where ring fencing and land sparing for nature is combined with sustainable agriculture intensification with the lowest trade-off indicated. Yeah, and with this, I would like to briefly conclude that systems methods might be useful to assess, to provide a transparent methodology for assessing trade-off between food security and conservation of biodiversity, for identifying policies that harmonize both aspects or even other aspects, important aspects of sustainable development. And in this respect, they might be useful to shed light on monitoring target 1. And I leave it with a question mark because I would like to get your opinion whether these introduced methods are useful for the discussion on conflicts and synergies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benjamin. So we won't take any questions now. There are questions in the chat, and if you could have a look at them and respond to them, that'd be great. Before we move to the next presentation, we have with us Gillian Campbell, who is the head of monitoring, review and reporting at the CBD Secretariat, and she would make a brief intervention now before she heads off for another meeting. But we have the privilege of having her here at this webinar. And Gillian, if you could come in and make an intervention. We can't see you yet.
No, you're not going to see me because I already had to leave. So I'm in the car. So this is unfortunate, but I've listened to all of the presentations. And so thanks for giving me the opportunity to say something. I think I had a presentation myself, but I thought that it was going to be before 10. So I apologize for my confusion on my side. But I was going to say something totally different than what I had decided that I was going to say after listening to the presentations thus far. So what I wanted to really point out is what is happening next. And I think both James and Alice talked a lot about sort of where do we go next now that the AHTEG has completed its term. And so what happens next? And so I wanted to say that when the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted, or when any framework is adopted, it it was a major achievement, but all of the implementation and the monitoring happens at the national level. And this is a very much of a shift from the previous strategic framework. I mean, implementation happened at the national level, but in the previous strategic framework, most of the monitoring was really only happening globally, at least the monitoring that was coming through the convention processes. So in terms of the NBSAPs and the national reports, which are the NBSAPs are the main implementing tool for countries to use to develop their strategies for implementing the convention, data was incredibly weak. We did an analysis, and only 20% of these NBSAPs had any sort of geospatial data that was included in the document. And so this shift that we've seen with the current strategic framework, with the Montreal Kunming Global Biodiversity Framework, is it's a game changer, because parties realized that if they are going to see a real change, then the monitoring has to happen nationally where the decisions are happening. And so the purpose of the monitoring framework that was adopted is really to guide national level decision making, to help countries figure out what they might want to measure, and to have some indicators that are standard across countries. And these headline indicators, the idea is that those would be the standard indicators across countries, but these would not be anywhere near what is required to guide national policy. What's required to guide national policy would be, those indicators are certainly useful, and so many more. And so the monitoring framework specifies that countries in developing their NBSAP should use the headline indicators, component complementary indicators, and national indicators, and the binary indicators, so that they should really be looking to develop a national monitoring plan and to see what is going to work for them. And so right now, in terms of the work that we are doing to support countries in developing their NBSAPs, and as Sunita knows, because we recently held an NBSAP dialogue in Japan, when we are working with countries to develop these NBSAPs, the idea of having a national monitoring plan embedded in the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan is something that it has really gained momentum. And this is something that parties are attempting to do. And I would say there is support across the board for this. It's not just that some parties are interested, or it's not a political issue. My impression is that all of the countries believe that monitoring is important. And obviously, different countries will monitor different things depending on their national priorities. But monitoring itself, in order to guide policy, there's universal agreement that this is important. And so then I also wanted to highlight that the AHTEG's results, in terms of the monitoring framework, they have focused on the headline indicators, but they also have done a review of the component complementary indicators. And one of the things that the AHTEG has really done in developing their guidance is coming up with a system of disaggregations that will allow countries to receive guidance on how to make the best use of the indicators that they have that are in the framework itself. So if you take the indicator on protected areas, which we were just talking about, there's a proposed disaggregation on governance, there's a proposed disaggregation on effectiveness, there's a proposed disaggregation on by ecosystem functional group using the IUCN global ecosystem typology. There's a proposed disaggregation based on land tenure. And so this would then provide you with a way to sort of overlay key issues like protected areas with a number of other issues, so that you can see where the strengths are and the gaps. And so this is all being presented in a document, which is called Information Document 14. It's the guidance from the AHTEG to SABSTA, and that's where all of the metadata is. And in that document, Alice had also mentioned a glossary. There is a glossary in this document. It is also up for a submission of views. So on the website of the convention, under notification 2024/033. Parties are invited to submit views on the indicators and on the guidance being provided. So unfortunately, the deadline for submission is today, but feel free to look there. But there's a glossary, there's metadata and definitions for each of the binary indicators. So the same as there's a methodology for each of the headline indicators, there's a methodology for each of the question-based indicators. And then there's guidance on applying the monitoring framework as a whole, which is in that document, and also in another information document 19, which went online today. And then there is a slew of other documents on the website as well, which provide guidance on specific indicators like the finance indicators, the ABS indicators. And so there really is, I mean, I think it's been an amazing amount of work to take the monitoring framework forward. And to me, the question is not what do we do at the global level next, but I think the question really is what happens at the national level next? How do parties now roll this out? How do they use these indicators? How do they develop their own monitoring systems? How do regional organizations develop monitoring that makes sense at the regional level? And when it comes time for the global review, which will be an effort to do a global analysis, we will be trying to bring all of this together. So it won't be just based on the headline indicators. It will be a review of the information that's available, but using the headline indicators and using other indicators, just mentioning again that the purpose of those indicators, though, is national level use, and this global analysis is really a secondary purpose. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gillian. Yeah, go on, Lily.
Well, the next presenter is Sunita.
Oh, okay. All right.
Sunita holds a PhD in agricultural economics from Bangalore, and she is a researcher at the Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability at the United Nations University in Tokyo. Please go ahead, Sunita, with your presentation.
Thank you, Lily. So you can see my screen, I guess, full screen?
Yes, not
now?
full yet.
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah, okay. Okay. So what I will be focusing on, and I'll try to be really brief, I am aware of the time, there's a lot being said about the indicators and the data and the inadequacies of data and all of that. But what the missing piece, but which is very well acknowledged actually in the KMGBF, is on acknowledging diversity and the priorities of different types of stakeholders that is influenced by the values that they hold for nature. And that's what I'd like to bring a little bit of focus on in my intervention. So before even getting into that, I think it's worthwhile, and that's what I said, the GBF really does make a huge leap forward in terms of identifying some critical issues, especially human dimensions, that need to be kept in mind when implementing the framework. And the section C of this GBF actually has a lot of these considerations. I've just taken 3 big ones here to suit my purpose here, but I think the rest of them really unravel from these 3 big points. One is acknowledging the roles, contributions, and the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. The other, looking at diverse value systems relating to nature and to how various contributions of nature are viewed with respect to people. So how do we view the various contributions we get from nature, and how do we prioritize them? And how do we relate to nature, whether it is just as something that provides us with material benefits or something that's much more relational? And that has a bearing on how conservation and use is determined. And of course, the big buzzwords or phrases of having a whole of government, a whole of society approach, which means everyone has a responsibility, there are obligations, everyone needs to contribute. But what everyone does is again linked to how to their worldviews, to their value systems. And the whole idea of having a whole of society approach and getting different government departments to be working together, that actually strives, and that's the section B of the GBF, which speaks about striving towards transformative change towards sustainability, broadly in that theme. And then getting into what transformative change means, as defined within the IUBS global assessment, is that it's a fundamental system-wide reorganization. So it's a very radical approach that's being envisaged. It's a huge aspirational document. The framework itself is highly aspirational. And if we are looking at having such a huge shift in whether it's technological, economic, social factors for achieving the various objectives of the convention, from conservation, sustainable use to equity, then that requires bringing on board multiple stakeholders, shifting the ways we are currently doing business, and all related activities related to that. And I'd like to bring some focus to this values assessment of IUBS again, where this was dealt with in greater detail, looking at how we currently are in this crisis because we've privileged certain values, especially market values, over several other values that exist, which are much more aligned with sustainability. And that it's not still a hopeless situation, that there do exist more opportunities to embed these diverse values that occur for more just and sustainable futures, that we can develop scenarios about, like how do we envisage the different types of futures that we may have. All of them could be sustainable, there could be different pathways. How do we get there? And linked to this is the idea that there are multiple ways people conceive a good quality of life, and how they conceive that determines the different values that they use to relate to nature, and how that's aligned with sustainability. As I already mentioned, so in different sectors, and especially across most sectors, it's the predominant economic and political decisions have prioritized market-based instrumental values. And this is not just in the case of economic activities. It's not just in the case of political decisions. Even conservation policies have been seen to have such a bias, where they risk downplaying the values of certain stakeholders, especially those of local communities that depend on nature for their livelihoods and for various cultural reasons. And so the way decision-making considers the values of nature at varying scales, from the local to at the national level, from local, subnational to national. This has impacts for how different social groups are represented in the decisions, and that's very important distinction to make, because we have this real, as Gillian mentioned, this is path breaking. The GBF is a bold step forward in bringing on board multiple perspectives. It's put the onus on people to take the right decisions. But again, the decisions need to be much more inclusive. They have to be pluralistic in their approach, because the voices of multiple social groups need to be included, or we'll continue to see these big trade-offs and these big conflicts that could arise. Because the underlying factor is that any such framework, the CBD or any such organization, any institutions, whether they're formal or informal, they influence whose values are counted in decisions. And to that extent, the framework with its various goals and targets itself acts as a value, what is called a value articulating institution, which means how it is being implemented, what it says, how it is implemented actually can determine what values are prioritized and thereby picked up by countries in their implementation. So it's very important. This is a point that Alice made in a detailed way, is that how these targets are interpreted, how the goals are interpreted, and how the indicators, what indicators are used. That it's important that there is clarity on that. It's important that we make that it is mandated that there's much more of an inclusive approach towards this. Otherwise, we will end up with an interpretation diffusion, which would be very unfortunate after coming up with a great framework like this. So there are some suggestions that we could, I mean, we need to definitely actively pursue opportunities for inclusive pluralistic approaches to assess and monitor progress in achieving our goals, and some options that people over here in the call, and also those who are actively engaged in work that relates to assessment and monitoring of the state and trends in biodiversity and socio-ecological systems could have is one. For the framework itself at the country level, it could be that of looking at how countries are reporting on including Section C considerations. How facilitative is the process of reporting for non-state actors? There is a provision for it, but how facilitative is it so that we could have more triangulation of information? Is it possible for the science community to work more closely with various kinds of partners on methods that incorporate information and data from different stakeholders? That needn't necessarily be just from large data sets, but comes from various other sources. There are some initiatives already, such as the Indigenous Navigator, where they are trying to link data from Indigenous peoples, from Indigenous communities, that's aligned really quite closely with the framework, but it's also then in a way it can be compared with what is it that is being reported by the countries themselves. So and this also has other priorities such as gender and other interest areas embedded within them. So some food for thought to see how there is definitely a need to make this more inclusive, because as Benjamin just now mentioned, we are talking about it's a narrative that we are trying to bring out, and for that we are trying to find the critical data points, critical information and knowledge sets that we have at hand from whatever levels that can help us to tell the story better. I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sunita. That was a very nice presentation on this human dimension that is always hard to capture among all this data missing also. I don't know if there is any question, or maybe Gillian Bonner from the University of Colorado, you want to say a few words?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I'm actually from Colorado State University, which is a different university down the road from University of Colorado in Boulder. But we're both in Colorado. Thank you for this opportunity. I just wanted to make a couple of very quick comments on sort of three issues that I heard from the different panelists. The first is on monitoring. Second is on biodiversity issues, or biocultural issues, and the third is on missing data. And on monitoring, just wanted to comment that I think one of the emerging challenges that falls within the goals of conservation the CBD has talked about in Goal 1 is understanding the use and application of community-based data or citizen science / participatory science type databases that look at data at the local level and address some of the granularity issues at the local level, especially when you look at different taxonomic groups. Second, I just wanted to comment on the biocultural issue and ecosystem services, and this was in the chat. In full disclosure, I'm a pollinator ecologist. I work mainly on different types of pollinators in the temperate zone, where most of our pollinators are insects. In the temperate areas, where in the tropical areas you have mammals and others also participating in pollination. It is important to note that data gaps, systematic data gaps, are significant, and they also cross cultural issues. And a good example is simply the honeybee. The bees, the use of bees in different parts of the world are dependent on different species that have cultural connections and some that do not. A good example is all honeybees in the North American continent are not native to North America. They are a domesticated species. So understanding how that influences our look at biodiversity loss in different taxonomic levels is really important, because that data gap is quite significant. If we looked at another great example on this biocultural connection, if we looked at local data and asked the question of biodiversity loss in temperate zones, what would probably come up on the hard data side, at least for North America, would be something like the monarch butterfly as emblematic of biodiversity loss. Even though this species is not necessarily a good pollinator from the plant's perspective, it is something that connects to the local communities and has strong cultural connections. You can just look at art, look at people's stories, etc., on the monarch butterfly, and you find it everywhere. So this becomes a vehicle to think about how to address conservation, and important for us as scientists to think about a vehicle that connects, and I believe, Ben, you may have been one who talked about it, or some others, that connect to policy makers and allows them to develop a framework that is effective to be used, and not get too tangled in the taxonomic details, whether this is a good pollinator or not, because we will miss the message of getting good conservation management in place at a timely fashion. And then my last sort of comment goes back to this missing data. And again, this is particularly important when we combine biocultural data with the term biodiversity loss. The data gaps in some taxonomic groups is significant, very significant. And again, I work mainly on insects, and most of the insects are incredibly data poor, yet they serve huge roles in ecosystem services. Just think about soil and all the soil organisms that we know very little about, yet have huge implications for our health and well-being, and things like food waste and food and agricultural production, and yet we know very little about them. Good example, in the United States, if you look at food waste, composting, etc., the #1 species involved in composting right now is an invasive species, and that is the Asiatic earthworm, and not the native North American earthworm. This is unknown to the general public. What its implications are highly unknown, but this is something for us to consider as we build a framework. And then second, that same issue of missing data and unknown data issue is when that taxonomic level makes a difference in whether we are looking at biodiversity loss or biodiversity change. So for example, again, going back to the pollinator world, there are many species of pollinators that are actually increasing with changing climate, and they're increasing quite rapidly. The Paris butterfly group is one. The white butterflies, I challenge anyone to go outside their window and you'll probably see a lot of white butterflies. They are native to North America, yet they are increasing. You also see this in many of the bee and wasp species that are increasing and not decreasing. So if we looked at biodiversity loss or change for an ecosystem service such as pollination, it becomes quite complex. And it's not simply a loss. It may be an increase. It may be a change. And that all ties to us paying attention, again, in the biocultural network, on the role of invasive species. Those that are invasive by human activity, or they're brought in like the honeybee as a domesticated species that's important to local communities, important for food and other things that are not native to the area. They're also important to understand as things shift, as the climate shifts, on whether we conserve these species, how do we manage them, or how do we get the policymakers to think about them? So I just wanted to throw those three thoughts out there on monitoring, biocultural issues, and missing data as important framework considerations as we move forward. So thank you very much for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Gillian. I will invite the speakers to comment on the presentations. Maybe James, you want to start?
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for an interesting set of presentations from everybody. There's a few messages I'd quite like to sort of just reiterate a little bit, if I may, please. I think the first thing is I've been putting links in the chat to a variety of documents that the AHTEG has been producing. Firstly, the Substa 26 document, Substa 26.2 is the major report. The IMP 14 document has the metadata for the binary and the headline indicators. It has a glossary, and it has information on applying Section C of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in terms of those cross-cutting considerations. And we put a lot of effort into thinking about that. The second point I bring out is about the balance of data that parties are expected to report and that may be available at a global level. And Gillian touched on this in terms of how any global assessment or synthesis may get pulled together. There is a balance in terms of how much data to expect out of national reporting processes, and the more disaggregations that you ask for directly, the more detail that you're asking for, including from developing countries and small island developing states, for example. So there is a need to think about what it is that we need to ask for at a national level and what it is that we can bring together at a global level and how we synthesize those things together. And whilst I agree from a scientific perspective that there are lots of data gaps, actually there's an enormous amount that we've been able to do over the last couple of decades. If you think back to the 2010 target, which was about reducing the current rate of biodiversity loss, we only really started thinking about indicators to measure that in the middle of the decade. When we had the AHTEG targets, we were ahead of the game slightly, but we didn't have any formal way of requiring parties to monitor and to report data. The fact that we've now got the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and in lockstep, we've got the monitoring framework, is actually an enormous step forward and will mean that we are looking at data coming directly from the national level about the implementation of national targets. And therefore, whilst I'm sure that we can improve indicators over time, I think there are two main messages that I would bring out. And the first is that we need to implement what we've got now in terms of being able to make sure that parties have the capacity to be able to report on the ambition that they have set themselves. And secondly, that we need to be bearing in mind that that's not a static picture, and that we need to be thinking forwards, as I put in one of my slides, towards 2030 and how we're going to be able to better measure things when we get to that point, because it's the same issues in terms of the direct drivers of biodiversity loss, about the issues around equity and effective management, about inclusion in terms of different societal groups. And it's really important that we continue our work, and that I think is one of the main challenges for the scientific community, is to be able to continue to work towards better measurement and to understand the balances that we're trying to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you. Because we didn't have time for questions with Benjamin, I would like to ask him, what kind of capacity challenges do you see, for instance, in Uganda to implement the methodology you presented?
Thanks, Lily. Yeah, I mean, in Uganda, the three systems methods I was introducing, I would say that the first two are very easily to apply. I mean, it needs a very short introduction, and people can work with them quite nicely, and they provide a structured way of getting relationships in the systems. For example, this mental maps or the systems diagrams. I experienced that this kind of drawing relationships on a paper with regional stakeholders, it's quite easy, and for me it's the best way of integrating their knowledge in this systematic science approach. Yeah, that's much better than with a fancy PowerPoint presentation and having complex presentation on the modeling, for example, which was the third method I am introducing. That's very complex to explain, even to you well-educated community. I mean, explaining such a complex land use model, it's a challenge. And I think using more easy accessible approaches like the systems diagrams or even the influence matrix, can be applied well. And the feedback that I received from stakeholders, not from Uganda, we didn't do this in Uganda, but I'm doing it recently in the Southwestern Amazon region on Southeast Asia. It was a very good interaction, and we got a good knowledge about how the system is working. For example, biocultural aspects that was just mentioned by Gillian. These are aspects that I don't know from Germany. If we do some studies in tropical peripheries, I mean, I don't know the systems, but by having these interactions with the local community, you realize some biocultural aspects that matter, and you try to find ways how to integrate this in your complex modeling, which you do at home as kind of homework. And then you can come back to the communities, present results, and interact with them. What does it mean to you? Is this correct? And you engage with them in the interpretation of the results.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. That's very interesting to have this possibility to interact with the local people. Thank you. Alice, you have 3 minutes.
So it's been great to hear from everyone, and I wanted to speak a little bit to Gillian's point on how do we do this at a national level. Now, there are a couple of different types of data we need to bear in mind, and of course, capacity building is a huge part of that. Mobilizing the data is not just something governments will do, it's something scientists need to get behind, and of course, there is a huge shortfall in available funding. However, there are organizations like GeoBond, the Global Biodiversity Observation Network, which have regional bonds, biodiversity observation networks. I am part of APBON, the Asia Pacific Biodiversity Observation Network, and part of what these regional organizations do is look at what data exists and how we can mobilize it. So, for example, in the Asia Pacific context, we are working with different countries. We are currently trying to census what data exists on biodiversity, if it is or is not accessible, and what might be possible in terms of mobilizing data that governments may have in private repositories that is not accessible, because without that data, we cannot census what biodiversity looks like. And so getting involved, whether you are a scientist or within governments with these kind of networks, we can start mobilizing much better data. And especially for wide-ranging species that occur across multiple countries, we can't get any idea of their status without having that kind of data. Now, I also mentioned at length Targets 5 and Targets 9 on sustainable trade and biodiversity. At the moment, when we think about wildlife trade, a lot of people are basically obsessed by illegal trade in wildlife, and yet this is only a tiny proportion of the use of wildlife. And we know that unsustainable but legal trade is a greater threat. Most countries currently do not see it as a priority to collect that kind of data, despite the fact that their customs agencies in some form are likely to be gathering it already. And so thinking about how to mobilize that data that is forgotten is something that is important, and yet it falls outside the conscious minds of many people. And so we do need to think about how to mobilize that kind of data. Ultimately, as Gillian and James have said, it's amazing that we have a scientifically backed agreement, including a monitoring framework. But now we need to think about how we instrumentalize it. That means thinking about what indicators are best for fit for purpose, making sure people are able to mobilize the data so that they can be meaningfully used at a national level, so that they can be comprehended, and so they can lead to action. And these are dialogues which are often not having, and scientists are often disengaged from the process. For those who have been at multiple COPs, you'll see that the academia section is slowly increasing, far too slowly. We do need to have more academics sitting around the table, and we need to have them talking to parties so we can start mobilizing that data. One of the major successes, as I mentioned, is the fact that some of the best indicators are those that had scientific working groups behind them who worked with parties. But many of the indicators that actually got basically demoted, they were potentially headline, they did not get finalized as headline, were seen as being too complicated. And that to me is not, it is not a lack of political will, there's a lack of political understanding. And so this is where we need the engagement with scientists so that they can make it understandable and get people behind it. Because unless you have that dialogue, unless you have those partnerships, unless you have scientists demonstrating, yes, we can do this. Yes, it works. It is not too complicated and we can collect the data. We can't expect the governments to get behind it. And so we need those scientists mobilizing the data and making it happen. And so for those who are listening on the call, look up GeoBon. Get involved, see who is engaging with government. And if you have data that you want to share, there are many people who are able to act on it. And that is how we as a group make progress. Thank you all.
Thank you, Alice. And yes, I guess it's a nice, I mean, you pretty much wrapped up all that we need to do. We all agree there's work to do. There's a lot that's there on the table that's been achieved, but still there's work to do, and we have to join hands and keep working on this. So hopefully, yeah, the framework will also somehow catalyze us all to get together to partner and do more interesting and meaningful work together. We are really way over time. I'd like to also express our gratitude for people who've stuck around. It's been an incredibly interesting discussion. I don't know, I'm like overstimulated. I don't know if I can go to sleep now after this, but thanks everyone again for this very engaging discussion. Thanks to all the presenters, the panelists, and the audience. There are questions there. I think most of them have been answered. If there's anything else that you might want to reach out to, I guess there's a way to do it through the YouTube channel or so. Over to you, Lily, for any final words before wrapping up, or we just wrap up?
Thank you, Sunita. I think that maybe Natalie has something to say about what do we go next with the presentations and the kind of summary we will have from this session.
Yeah, exactly. On the IUBS website, you will be able to find all the information of the current webinars and the former ones. And if the presenters want to share their presentation today, we can also put it on the website. There will be also a report from the different webinars that will be on the website, and there will be a document wrapping up everything that will be prepared. And of course, we will prepare with other partners a science forum in Cali in October in Colombia. And the videos can also be seen on the YouTube channel of VBio, who was our partner to organize the webinars. So thank you, everyone, and good day, good evening, or good night, depending where you are. And thank you very much for your participation. It was really, really interesting to hear all of you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Back to you, Kristen.
Bye-bye.